and welcome to Bloody Good Reads. I am your host, Mike Goddard, and this week's guest has a brand new book on his way out from our good friends over at Cemetery Dance Publications. We're just going to go into depth, as we always do, into his back bibliography and find out how he got into the horror genre. So this week's guest, welcome to the podcast, Preston Fassel.
And thank you for having me on.
No worries. Again, what we like to do here on Bloody Good Reads is force authors to pick 3 books that they love, because I am a bastard. But before we get to that stage, and before we get to learn a bit about your work, I'm going to ask you, like I ask every guest that comes on the podcast, how did you get into the horror genre?
It's funny because my mother and I really love horror movies, and that was something that we is something we've always shared. And she's the person who showed me the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Shining. When the Saw movies were in first run, she and I would go every year. That was a fun little tradition of ours. But it's my father, who absolutely hates horror films, who got me into it. Because there was this weird period there in the 80s where they were releasing all of these horror comedies that were really big mainstream successes, like Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice and The Monster Squad. And for this guy who just really hates horror films, he really loved these movies. And these were some of the very first movies that he showed me. Some of my earliest cinematic memories are of sitting with my dad in our living room in St. Louis and watching Beetlejuice, Ghostbusters, yada yada yada. And the damnedest thing was that these things traumatized me. For stuff now that I watch it as an adult, and it's like, oh, this is really fun, this is really cool. At like 3 years old, 4 years old, Beetlejuice, Ghostbusters scared the absolute shit out of me. That library ghost at the beginning of Ghostbusters, the scene where Beetlejuice turns into a snake and terrorizes the family. I was terrified of that. And I would be screaming and putting my head under the covers and just wanting it to stop. And then the movie would end, and I would say, "Can we watch it again?" And I just had this weird drawback to this stuff that absolutely terrified me. And that pattern just continued all throughout my adolescence, all throughout my formative years, where I would watch something, it would be the worst thing ever. I wouldn't want to see or read or be around anything that was even remotely horror oriented. And then time would pass, and I would just feel this compulsion to go back to it. And so when I was about probably 16 or 17, I made the conscious decision that I didn't like anything having that kind of power over me. I didn't like something being able to influence me to that degree and make me feel that unsafe, that uncomfortable. And I kind of unknowingly gave myself cognitive behavioral therapy, because what I started to do was go to the video store, hunt down the nastiest, most depraved, most terrifying movies I could, and then just binge watch them, with the idea that if I watched enough, I would become desensitized to it. It wouldn't scare me anymore, and therefore it wouldn't have that power over me anymore. And not only did that actually end up working, but I also discovered, hey, there's some really great stuff out there that is in the horror genre. And I really started to dive deeper and deeper into the world of horror films. And around the same time, one of those movies that I rented was this film called Heartbreak Motel, which I found out later was the producer's cut of another film called Poor Pretty Eddie. And for anybody listening to this, I do not advise watching either of those movies. It is one of the most it's one of the most reprehensible things I've ever seen. It's just completely degenerate. It is not a good movie, but it was also just completely baffling to me. I'm like 16, 17. It's a movie. It stars Shelley Winters, Leslie Uggams, and Ted Cassidy, who played Lurch on the original Addams Family. And it's about this jazz singer whose Rolls Royce breaks down during a road trip through the American South. And this woman ends up being held hostage by a depraved Elvis impersonator. Not a good movie, but like I said, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And I just remember thinking to myself after this thing ended, what the fuck did I just watch? And I went out online, trying to find information on this, and this is in the kind of earlier days of the internet, around 2003, this would have been. And the only reference I could find to this movie was in a book called Sleazoid Express. And I thought to myself, okay, you want to learn more about this movie, you got to buy this book. So I ordered this book, and the book is something of a combination film review guide slash travel log. It was written by this guy named Bill Landis and his wife Michelle Clifford. And back in the early 1980s, Bill Landis lived and worked in New York City and would spend all of his downtime going to all of the movie theaters on 42nd Street and watching all of the films that were playing there. And a vast majority of these were in the horror genre. And I had no idea that something like 42nd Street had existed. It was this entire uh, almost human ecosystem that had built up around these movie theaters in 42nd Street. And there were entire subcultures of people that gravitated around going to watch movies at the 42nd Street theaters. And it just completely blew my mind that there could have been a time and place like this, and opened my eyes to this entire world I never knew existed. And so between Sleazoid Express and my own unintentional CBT campaign on myself, those were the two big things that cemented me as a horror lover and ultimately horror writer.
But what was your kind of entry into horror fiction? Did you, because I think you're kind of forcing yourself really to watch horror films, kind of desensitize yourself a little bit. But what was your reading patterns like growing up? Was you into horror growing up, or was it more kind of off the back
Yes.
of getting into the films?
Yeah, and it was a very similar pattern to movies. I loved the Goosebumps books by R.L. Stein. And
Hmm.
if my parents weren't buying them for me, then our school library had them. Considering that I went to a religious school in middle America in the late 80s and early 90s, they were actually very liberal in terms of what they provided to us to read. And they had the Goosebumps books. And it was the same thing. I'd read a book, and just if they would give me nightmares, the stuff I would read would traumatize me even worse than the stuff I would watch. I remember the very first Goosebumps book, Welcome to Dead House, and there's this scene where the protagonist has this nightmare that she and her family are dead, and they're sitting at a dining room table and they're eating bones, if I recall correctly. And the way it was written and the way it was described was just so morbid. I had nightmares about it for weeks, and I didn't want to touch a Goosebumps book. I didn't want to see a Goosebumps book. And then, like, 2 months later, a new one comes out, and it's like, Mom, can you buy me the new Goosebumps book? And I would just do this again and again. Oh, the one with the hands, the one with the piano teacher, and there's like severed hands playing pianos. That one gave me nightmares, and it was the same thing. And then I remember I was 13 years old, and my mother and I were at the drugstore picking up a prescription, and they had this wire rack right there with paperback books on it. And one of them was The Shining. And I was just aware of The Shining as a thing because growing up in a post Stanley Kubrick's The Shining world, it's just impossible not to consume media and not see that parodied. The Here's Johnny or the Twins or whatever. Rocco's Modern Life. That's how I first became aware of it. The cartoon Rocco's Modern
Hmm.
Life, an entire
Yeah,
episode.
remember that one?
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about.
Of course.
Yeah. And so that's how I first became aware of The Shining. That and Twister, the scene where it's playing at the drive-in when the tornado hits. And so I pick
Hmm.
up this paperback book of The Shining just to kill time. And I remember the very first line of The Shining contains the phrase "officious prick." And I did not know at 13 that you could put profanity in a book. I had been reading like the great illustrated classics, and I had actually read the real versions like of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and A Christmas Carol, and I had this very prim, proper view of literature. And to realize, oh wow, you can have people swear in a book was like this mind blowing experience for me. And so at 13, I convinced my mother to get me The Shining, and that was in my mind like the first real like adult book that I'd ever read. Even though, like I said, I had read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Christmas Carol, there was something about The Shining that made me feel you have crossed this threshold. This is a rite of passage. This is your first grown up book. And that was my entree into the world of horror literature as a grown up.
Awesome. So before we go into kind of what got you into writing, again, what we like to do here in a podcast is force authors to pick 3 books they love. So, what is your first bloody good read?
That is going to be Billy Bathgate by E.L. Doctorow.
Okay, not heard of that one.
It's great. It was the winner of the Penn Faulkner Award and was a runner up for the Pulitzer Prize. It lost to the Mambo Kings. And it is the story of a 15-year-old boy living in 1930s New York who falls in with a group of mobsters. And the gang in the book, the Dutch Schultz gang, is based on a real Jewish American organized crime family that existed in 1930s America, and it's just a really great story. It's this kind of dark satire of the American capitalistic landscape as it existed in the 1980s, and kind of parallels and draws all of these similarities between the Wall Street tycoons of the 1980s and the gangsters of the 1930s. And it's a really fun book. It's written in the first person, and the narrator has this very wry, sardonic sense of humor that makes the book very enjoyable. But then also the way the book is written, I had never read anything written quite like this before. It's written largely in the present tense with these occasional segues into the past tense when the narrator is like speaking to you as a reader in the 80s versus like recalling these memories of the 1930s. And there's these very long, windy, almost Faulkner-esque sentences that can last for like an entire page. And it has this real sense of urgency and you are there sensibility. And just between the story itself being really fun and engaging and the way that it was written, it just absolutely blew my mind. And even still to this day, I first read that when I was probably about 16, and even still to this day, it remains one of my favorite books.
Brilliant. And you can get that on Kindle for about $3.99 in the UK as well. So it's a good price to go and give it a check out. So brilliant choice. Not had it on the podcast before, so I do like when I haven't had on there before. Brilliant. So, what got you into writing? Was you quite a heavy writer during kind of growing up in school, or was it more kind of later on in life for you?
So when I was in the first grade, our school's vice principal was retiring, and the school wanted to put together like this going away package for her. And one of the things they wanted to put in there were short stories written by the students about why Mrs. Tomaine had to leave school. And so they had all of us write these little short stories coming up with what was our explanation, what was our reason for why Mrs. Tomaine was retiring. And the story that I came up with was at the school at the time, we had this thing called the Gold Slip program. And if you were caught performing a good deed or some sort of civic act or helping a teacher out, you'd get this little gold slip of paper and you could save them up and then redeem them for toys, prizes, yada, yada, yada. And so the explanation that I came up with was that all of the students at school were behaving so well and they were handing out so many gold slips that the program was no longer sustainable. And so, as a pretense to get rid of the program, Mrs. Tomaine had vandalized the school and then blamed it on the students and used that as an excuse to get rid of the gold slip program. But then they caught her on security camera vandalizing the school. And so now she had to go on the run from the law, and that was the reason that she was leaving. And I write the story and I turn it in, and my teacher reads it, and she tells the classroom assistants, "Watch the class. I have to go to the principal's office." And she leaves, and then a couple of minutes later, she comes back and she says, "Preston, you need to come with me." And Mrs. Maher takes me to the principal's office, and I'm thinking to myself, "Oh crap, you've done it now. You shouldn't have written that story. You're in big trouble." And she takes me in, and there's the vice principal, Mrs. Tomaine, there's the principal, there's the school secretary, and there's Mrs. Maher. And Mrs. Maher sits me down and she hands me my own story and she says, "I want you to read this out loud." And so I do. And I'm terrified the entire time. And when I get to the end of this, everybody bursts out laughing. and they are applauding and they think it's just the greatest thing. And that was the moment that I realized that I had an ability to do something with words that had that kind of impact on people. And I've pretty much just known from that moment that I was going to be a writer, and that maybe practically speaking I would need to get some kind of side job. I always had this very utilitarian view of the world that, very few people actually get to work as writers. So I always figured, even from adolescence, okay, you're going to have another job, but you will be a writer. And I've followed it ever since.
Cool. So your first kind of jump into writing was that Our Lady of the Inferno, which is 2016.
Yes. So prior to that, I'd only really had one other thing published. I actually, to this day, still work as a writer for a trade publication called 2020 Magazine, which is all about optics. While I was getting my foot in the door of writing, I worked as an optician and optometric assistant, and through that, got my first consistent paid writing gig for this trade publication. And for their 40th anniversary, they wanted to do some kind of unique story to commemorate the magazine having been around this long. And the editor, James Spina, who I still work for, convinced the rest of the staff, we've got this guy working for us who really wants to be a fiction writer, and he's a great nonfiction writer. Let's give this guy a crack. Let's have him write a fiction story for the magazine, and this short story will be our commemorative story, and it will be something relating to optics and something related to eyeglasses and our profession. And so this would have been 2013 or 14. I had this short story published in the magazine, and it was the first time that I'd ever run something fiction, and it just got a fantastic response. And that's what kind of lit the fire under me to really sit down and write this book that I had inside of me. Prior to that point, I had written books. Actually, junior year of high school, I was so far ahead on all of my academic studies that my parents actually arranged with my high school. They allowed me to start bringing a laptop to school, and for the classes where I was ahead, right. So I wrote a couple of books while I was in high school, and then another while I was in college, and they all suck. And I hope to God they never see the light of day. I think I've destroyed all the copies of them. I think there might be some floating around on an old computer tower somewhere, and if I find it, hopefully I can wipe it. But after writing this short story, it was like, yeah, the time is now. You need to sit down. You need to write your book. And so that was Our Lady of the Inferno. I wrote that in 2014, and then spent 2015 and most of 16 shopping it around. Got it published initially in 2016, and then immediately afterwards, the publisher went under. And it got picked up by another publisher after that, and they were around for about 2 years, and they went under. And finally, that found its, what I hope is its forever home with Encyclopocalypse Publications. But yeah, that was my first feature length published fiction book.
Did it get picked up by Fangoria's imprint
Yes, that was the
when
second
Fangoria went
publisher.
out? Yeah.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that was,
'Cause-
yeah.
yeah. Okay. Okay. And it's like, oh, I've got, I can't pronounce the name of the new publisher now because we deal with them as well. Encyclopocalypse. Yeah, that's the one.
Encyclopocalypse. Yeah.
Yeah, they've really been releasing a lot of amazing titles that just got lost by original publishers as well. So it's a great little place to get your book kind of housed, really.
Yeah, they were really fantastic because when Fangoria got sold, the new owners opted not to carry over their literary imprint. They wanted to focus exclusively on the magazine. And so the Fangoria books all ended up in this kind of weird legal limbo, because it's like, well, the old company doesn't exist anymore. The new company doesn't want to publish books. So what happens to this stuff? And Encyclopocalypse was really great. Mark Miller is the owner and founder, and he stepped in and negotiated to get most of those books back into print, including Our Lady of the Inferno. And yeah, I'm just incredibly pleased with them. They're a great they're a great publisher. their in-house artist, and he's also a writer for them, Christian Francis. The cover art that he did for the new edition of Our Lady of the Inferno is by far my favorite. It really captures the spirit and the feel of the book. He really intuited something about the story and just really gave it this great cover art that I'm really pleased with.
Cool. And it was supposed to be an audio drama as well, starring Barbara Crampton.
Yes, and one of the best moments of my creative life is that Barbara Crampton was in Dallas for a horror film convention, and I actually got to go pick her up at the airport and take her to a recording studio here in Dallas, and I actually got to direct her in reading her lines and performing her lines for the audio drama, and that was a really special experience for me. And to direct Barbara Crampton as this cannibal serial killer stalking the streets of 1980s New York, and she just gave it her all. She treated that exactly like she would treat any cinematic role. On the way to the studio, she and I talked in the car about the character, and she asked me questions about motivation and how to deliver lines, and she was just really great. And if you want to hear Barbara Crampton just going absolutely batshit and screaming and grunting like an animal and doing something not quite like she has ever done before or has done since. The Our Lady the Inferno audio drama is the place to hear it. And Doug Bradley's also in there, as a matter of fact, who
Oh,
does a
brilliant.
great performance as a Polish gangster. And he just really nails the accent.
Awesome. And the ironic thing is, Barbara Crampton's really kind of heavily involved with the Fangoria film line now, which is it's just it's a weird turn of events, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, amazing. Um, Before we go on to the new book though, because that's coming out soon. Is it March? You said it was coming out, the new
March
book.
17th, yes.
So by the time this podcast is out, yeah, it'll be a bit earlier than release date. But before we get on to the brand new book, what is your second bloody good read?
Michael Cunningham's The Hours.
Good pick. Good pick.
Yeah, yeah. I read that because I was just absolutely in love with Nicole Kidman as a teenager. Was my favorite actress. I thought that she was God's gift to the world. I still very much enjoy her as an actress, but I'm also no longer a hormonally charged, starstruck teenager. But just absolutely loved her and would watch anything she was in, even if it wasn't my genre. And she was in the film adaptation that came out in, I want to say, 2003 with Julianne Moore, who I was also head over heels in love with. Wow, this was the greatest thing in the world to me. Nicole Kidman and Julianne Moore in the same movie. And then Meryl Streep, yeah, Meryl Streep. And so ahead of the film adaptation coming out, I got the book because at that time, if I was going to watch a movie that was an adaptation of the book, I had to read the book first because I was a
Mhm.
pretentious teenage boy. And like Billy Bathgate was just blown away by this. I think no, Billy Bathgate is written in the present tense as well. No, wait, he had to have planned it. Portions of Billy Bathgate are written in the present tense, but the hours is written entirely in the present tense. And between this unique voice and the way that Michael Cunningham wrote it, and then just the emotional intensity of the story, it was another one of these things that like opened my eyes to what literature could be and what a book could be and the impact that it could have on somebody. And that's another one of these books where, like, even to this day, I still find myself thinking about it and still feel myself connected to it in a way that's really profound and isn't quite like my response to a lot of other books that I've read.
Brilliant pick. Brilliant film as well.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, it's a good, great choice, that one. Okay, so your brand new book coming out at the end of March is Beast of 42nd Street. So that's coming from our good friends over at Cemetery Dance Publications. We deal with them quite a lot over here on the podcast. So tell us a bit about the book, inspiration behind it, without giving too much away.
So Our Lady of the Inferno got picked up by Fangoria. They published it, and it did very well. And the then owners came to me and said, "Look, this was a big success. We want to repeat it. We want you to write another book for us." And you have got carte blanche. We trust you. We like you as a writer. You've got a great imagination. There's no restrictions. Write whatever you want. Write any kind of story you want. We just want an authentic Preston Fassel original horror story. And what I really wanted was something that I felt was missing in the world of horror publishing, which was something really transgressive, something really subversive, something like what was coming out of horror publishing in the 1980s that I felt got lost in the 90s and the 2000s. Something like Books of Blood era Clive Barker, something like early Joe Lansdale, something that really had something to say and used really subversive literature in order to say it. And so that's what I wrote. And the then owners of Angoria said, "Great, we love it. We're going to put it out." And then they got sold. And
Mhm.
as part of my severance package, everybody who worked for the old staff was laid off in the process. As part of my severance package, I got the rights to Beast of 42nd Street back. And at that time, it had only been months away from publication. It was originally slated for publication in September of 2020. And in the lead up to that, we had been sending it out for blurbs and for early reviews. And I had gotten these great blurbs for it. Bloody Disgusting loved it. The AV Club loved it. Rebecca McKendry loved it. The then president of the Horror Writers Association of America loved it. Mick Garris loved it. Uh, just across the board, I was getting all these great reviews. One of the last conversations I had with our in house publicist was her telling me this might be on routes to be the best reviewed horror book of 2020. And I thought to myself, okay, you got the rights back. You basically just have to walk up to a publisher's door, knock, hand this to them, and they're going to love it. And 2020 to 2022 demonstrated to me that I had perhaps done my job a little bit too well, because the across the board response that I got from the like 2 dozen publishers and agents that I sent Beast to 42nd Street to was, "This is great, and we're not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole." One person told me, and this kind of sums everything up, and this isn't an exact quote from the letter, I don't have it on me, but it was more or less, "This is too tonally upsetting." And the thing about it is, the book doesn't have a high body count. There's no torture scenes. There's no like hostile style, like mutilation fests. It is a very character driven story. It's a very period driven story, 1960s and 70s New York. It's not something that meditates on visceral things, but I had just written something whose tone was upsetting. And I really thought that, this wasn't going to get a release. Encyclopocalypse was great. They told me, at this point in our evolution as a publisher, we can't really give this a kind of red carpet rollout. We can't really put a lot into a advertising campaign. This was going back to 2020. They've got a much better infrastructure now, but they had always offered that they would provide a home for this, but that it might not have the biggest of releases. And so I was at the point where I thought, okay, we're going to do it with Encyclopocalypse. And the very first place I had submitted the book after I got the rights back to was Cemetery Dance. And I hadn't heard back from them. And I kind of thought, no news is no news, that they just didn't want this thing, and that they kind of shared the opinion of everybody else. And I I had asked for advice from a writer named Brian Keene, about where I might take this book. And I hadn't heard back from him. And I initially thought, okay, he just doesn't want to talk to me. And then one day I got an email from Brian, and he said, I'm very sorry that this kind of got pushed down in my log. And he says, "I want you to reach out to Cemetery Dance. Here is the personal email of their acquisitions editor. Don't go through the regular email, and tell them that I sent you." And I
Okay.
sent an email and got a response back from Kevin Lucia, who is their current acquisitions editor. and he had just taken over, had just gotten the job. And as it turned out, the manuscript for Beasts of 42nd Street had gotten buried in their slush pile, and for 2 years had just sat there unread at the bottom of the inbox, and was still unopened after 2 years. And Kevin jumped on it. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a response back, and he said, "I love this. I agree with what everybody else has said, that you've told me about, that it is very upsetting, it's very disturbing, it's very transgressive, and I love that. And we're going to publish it." And here we are now talking about it today.
Brilliant. It's a great person to get on your side as Brian Keane. So very, very good person.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to him. If he had not done that, I don't know what would have ended up happening with the book. I got to meet him in person for the last time meet him in person for the first time last November at a horror writers convention that was held at a Barnes and Noble here in the States, and it was a great honor for me to get to shake his hand and thank him in person for hooking me up that way and helping get the book where it is now. He and Kevin are two of the heroes of the story of Beasts.
Very good. And you can't pick a better publisher than Cemetery Dance. They do so much great work at the moment, and they will go with their heart. Especially Kevin, he's very good at this, what he does, and he's got some great picks, and he's picked some amazing authors. We've had him on the podcast before, so I know he's got some great taste. So brilliant. Okay, so let's go on to your third bloody good read while we're here then. So before we go deeper into the book, or we'll talk a bit more about the book, let's go into your third choice. So what is your third and final bloody good read?
Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John Le Carre.
Classic pick.
Yeah, I first read that after I saw the Gary Oldman film adaptation, and really loved the movie. And it intuited from the film that they had to cut a lot out of the story in order to fit it into a 2 hour runtime. Uh, of course, I've seen the BBC version since, but for the film adaptation, they really condense it. And read the book and was I feel really repetitive saying this, but blown away once again. Uh, I didn't know that spy fiction could also be literature, and I love that he has taken this genre that is nominally very pulpy and just very action driven and made it literary. And that began a love affair with John Le Carre that continues to this day. I've ended up reading all of his books. He's one of the few writers who I have read their entire body of work, and Tinker Tailor remains one of my favorites. I love that it is a spy story that is more bureaucratic than action driven, but which at the same time, I feel like any workplace, any group environment that you have ever been in, you can recognize in the world of John Le Carre's circus and the George Smiley books. He just really captures something about what it is to be in a workplace, to be in a group dynamic, and just has such an eye and ear for different personality types. And Tinker Tailor is just brilliant.
Brilliant pick. And yeah, 3 picks we haven't had on the podcast before, so that is always a first on here, because it's usually be a Stephen King book. So I'm glad you haven't picked a Stephen King book. I was worried it might go for Shining, but long running joke on this podcast, everybody picked Stephen King. Brilliant pick, brilliant pick. So what are you working on currently? Is there anything in the works at the moment that you're working on, ready to release, say this year, next year, or?
So I've got a book that is currently slated to come out in October. It's going to be my first major. I hate saying major, but my first big five book. It's coming out through an imprint of Simon and Schuster. It's a nonfiction book,
Mhm.
and it's called Necessary Death. And I'm co-authoring it with another gentleman named Chris Grasso. He and I were both contributors to the last iteration of Fangoria, which is how we met. And he read Our Lady of the Inferno and reached out to me to tell me he liked it. And we became friends based on that. And he is a mental sorry, my mind just blinked out. A drug and alcohol abuse counselor and mental health counselor, and I actually went to university for psychology. I actually have a degree in psychology, and he and I had spitballed this thing about writing a book that looks at themes of well-being and mental health in horror films. And we first conceptualized this back in 2019, and then COVID hit, and it kind of got put on the back burner. And then late last year, his agent got back to us after 1923 years and said, "Hey, I know this thing got stalled, but you guys remember that proposal that you came up with 3 years ago? Well, I just sold it to an imprint to Simon and Schuster." And so he and I are currently working on that. I've got 3 chapters left to write on that, and then that is going to be coming out in October through HCI Books, which is an imprint to Simon and Schuster. And then I'm also currently at work on a fiction project that is this kind of magnum opus for me. I first came up with the idea for it in high school and started trying to write it in high school and realized you are not mature enough as a writer to tell this story right now, and you need to get some more experience as a writer and some more experience as a person before you can tackle this project. And last year, I realized this thing that I'd had on the back burner for almost about 20 years now was finally ready to come to fruition. And it is a House of Leaves style faux making of book about a botched horror film shoot in the 1980s. And the conceit of the book is that I, Preston Fassel, horror writer, have tracked down everybody who is still alive from this failed movie shoot that took place in the 1980s. And the book is this faux oral history, ostensibly made up of all the interviews I've conducted and all of the research that I've done into why this horror movie bombed. And because it is a horror book, of course, horror elements get involved, ghosts get involved, the supernatural gets involved, and it is all about why this movie never got completed and why it was never commercially released and why the production company buried any evidence of its existence. And I'm about halfway through that now. My agent jokes that it's a doorstop book. It's probably going to be about 120,000 words. She says if I can bring it to heel at about that, then she can work with it. But yeah, I'm about halfway done with that, and I'm very happy with how it's turning out, and I'm happy that I waited as long as I have to tell this story.
Brilliant. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast this week. Where can people find you if you'd like to be found?
I'm on Twitter at Preston Fassel, and my name will be on the podcast. So just my first and last name all together. And that's really about it. So I keep meaning to get some kind of website up. Uh, I keep forgetting or failing to. So yeah, pretty much you can find me on Twitter.
Awesome. And I'll put the link to your Twitter in the description below, as I always do.
Thank you.
So, yes, thank you to Preston for coming on the podcast this week. Go and check out the brand new book. That's Beasts of 42nd Street. That'll be out about end of March, around 17th of March. Podcast comes out way before then, randomly, because we don't normally do ones in advance as much as we used to. But yeah, go check it out when it is released, and go check out a bit more information over at Cemetery Dance as well. As always, a huge shout out to our sponsor, Abominable Book Club. They're the UK's best and biggest UK horror and thriller book box service, bringing the wonders of a haunted bookshop straight to your door each month. I've literally just got this month through the door yesterday, so I can't tell you what we've got in the book box this week. Previous guest Andy Davison's new book, The Hollow Kind, is in the box. Got to love the cover on this one. I actually love the cover of this one more than I do of the American version of that. And also go back and listen to an interview with him as well for that one. And also The Tangle by Justin Robertson as well. That is the main book in the box this week as well. You also get an amazing bag, second-hand book, badges, chocolate this time round, and bookmarks. Loads of amazing stuff inside the box. Use the code Bloody Good Reads at checkout to get 10% off your first box. If you get it in now, hopefully you can get in time for March, which is the newest book from Eric LaRocca. is in the March box. We've already been told this one, spoiler alert, or it will be for April's box, depending on when you hear this podcast. But do go check them out. It's Bottom of Book Club at cratejoy.com. It's in the description below. You know we love them here. Been sponsoring us for the last 3 years, so go check them out. You can follow me over at Twitter at Bloody Good Reads, on Instagram at Bloody Good Reads, and over on Facebook at the Bloody Good Reads Book Club. Also, come and join the chat. We've got a new chat function on Facebook. I don't know where this came out of nowhere, so go and check us out. Come and chat to other horror fans as well on there. As always, I have been your host, Mike Goddard. 5-star review over on iTunes or over on Spotify gets more eyes on the podcast. And if you do like the podcast and you got any idea of who you want to listen to or actually hear their backstory on this podcast, give me a shout as well at bloodygoodreads at hotmail.co.uk. As always, I've been your host, Mike Goddard, and I'll see you next time.